Hi, it's Rabbi Jeremy from Mahar, and I'm here for our Words on Wednesday for this week. Last week, we talked about the word Torah or Torah, and that word in Hebrew has a lot of different meanings. We talked about how it could mean the scroll that is a Torah scroll, that it could mean the content of that scroll, which are the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We talked about the idea that Torah can mean all of the stuff interpreting what's in the Torah for thousands of years worth of interpretation. Some of it's on the shelf behind me. And we talked about the idea that Torah can be Jewish learning in its biggest way. Everything that kind of comes off of the books that are really the formative books for Jewish life. All those meanings are meanings of the word Torah, as well as just the basic meaning of the word Torah, which means instruction. The Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, is made up of 3 large chunks of stuff. Tanakh stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Tanakh isn't a real word, Tanakh is an acronym. So Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. We talked about Torah, so let's talk about the other 2 chunks of the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible, Nevi'im and Ketuvim. So Nevi'im first, because they come right after the Torah in a Jewish version of the Bible. Nevi'im, the word Navi in Hebrew means prophet. So Nevi'im is the plural. Nevi'im means prophets. There are a number of books that fall into that category. Actually, the largest number of books in the Hebrew Bible in the Tanakh are actually the Nevi'im, the prophetic books. So they basically fall into 2 kind of lumps of material. The books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings are called the former prophets because they're the first 4 to 6 books in the Nevi'im, the prophetic section of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings are also sometimes called historical books because they tell a story. They claim to be telling a unified story of the Israelites from right after when the Torah says Moses died, all the way up through the return from the Babylonian exile. So they claim to be telling a story that's about 1,200 years, that's about 700 years long. So they claim to be telling a story for a long period of time. The viewpoint of the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, is that the Israelites prospered, they had good lives when they followed the commandments, they had bad lives when they didn't. That basic viewpoint, that you prosper when you follow all the rules and you suffer when you break all of the rules, is one that's shared by the other books in the Nevi'im, in the prophets. Those other books, the latter prophets, there's actually a bunch of them. There are 15 of them, and they are named after individual prophets. So we have Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Each of them has a pretty large book, 50, 60 chapters each. And those books claim to have collected those prophets' prophecies. The other books, there are another 12 prophetic books, also named after individual prophets, and they claim to have collected the prophecies of those other prophets, but they're smaller books, and so they're called minor prophets, those other 12 prophets. And these include prophets that are kind of important culturally, in particular, the prophet Amos, who is actually quoted by Martin Luther King Jr. a lot. So these are the prophetic books. And the prophetic books all share the viewpoint that when the Israelites followed the commandments, they would prosper, and when they didn't follow the commandments, they would be punished. That's their way of looking at the world. It's important to know that a Navi, a prophet, is not understood by the Tanakh to be a fortune teller. We think of prophets as being people who can see the future. And that's not really what the prophets in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, that's not what they really were trying to do. What they were doing was they would look at the world around them, and they would look at how politics around the world, in their world, because they didn't really know much outside the Middle East, they would look at how politics in their world were likely to affect Israelites, and then say, these bad things that are happening, they're happening because you're not following the rules. But change your ways, follow the rules, and you'll be saved from whatever this coming danger is. That was how the biblical prophets viewed the world and how they operated. So that's what a Navi, a prophet, or a Nevi'ah, a prophetess, did. Looked at the world, said, change your behavior and this bad thing won't happen. And they believed that this kind of insight came from the God of Israel. So they said, the God of Israel says. So that's what's in the prophetic books, the Nevi'im. Ketuvim is a much more mixed bag of material. So the Ketuvim means writings. Ketuvim has got a lot of different kinds of books in it. So it has books that are kind of like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Joshua and Judges. They have books that are kind of like historical books. 1st and 2nd Chronicles claims to tell the same basic historical story that especially 1st and 2nd Kings tell. They claim to be telling the story of the kings of Israel. They tell the story differently. They don't always have the same stuff as 1st and 2nd Kings does, and they have a different viewpoint. They have different things that they're concerned about. So that's 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We also have other books that are story kinds of books as well that are part of the Ketuvim. So we have the Book of Esther. Book of Esther is the story that gets read on Purim. And so it says, the story of Esther and Mordecai and King Ahasuerus that we read on Purim, right? So it only just covers this little period of time. We don't really know when this period of time happened. There was no king clearly named Ahasuerus. We don't really know if there was a historical Esther. Right? So we don't know how true the story is. There's another book that's a story kind of book as well, the Book of Ruth. And the Book of Ruth tells the story of Ruth, who was actually not an Israelite. She was a Moabite, but she became an Israelite and is said to be the grandmother of King David. So we have the story of Ruth, we have the story of Esther, we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles, these books that tell stories that are trying to fill in the stories of Israelite history. We have other ones too. So also in the Ketuvim is the Book of Psalms. So when you hear people reading about Psalms or reading Psalms, these biblical poems, that's where it comes from. It's part of the Tanakh. It's in the Ketuvim section, in the writings section. There's also literature that's called wisdom literature. And there are several pieces of that. So there's a book called Proverbs, a book called Ecclesiastes, and a book called Job. And those are generally acknowledged to be about following basic ideas of wisdom. And these aren't exactly the same as following the rules that are in the Torah. They have their own approach to things. Proverbs is a collection of sayings that are wisdom kinds of sayings. Ecclesiastes is a grumpy version of Proverbs in some ways. A lot of people know what's in Ecclesiastes because they've heard the birds' song, turn, turn, turn. Turn, 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 a time to be born, a time to die. That's just right out of the book of Ecclesiastes. So you probably already know at least a little bit from the Ketuvim. The book of Job is in there, and the book of Job is actually criticizing all of the ideas that we find in the Tanakh. And then there are a lot of poetry books. So there's a book called Song of Songs, which is really a love poem. That's part of the Ketuvim. There's a book called Lamentations. Lamentations is a long poem that laments, that mourns the loss of the temple in Jerusalem. So we've got kind of a mixed bag of stuff in the Ketuvim. We've got some historical stuff. We have some stuff that seems like it's prophetic. We have some stuff that's wisdom material. We have some stuff that's straight up poetry of different kinds. Those things put together, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings, make up the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible. So those are our words for today: Tanakh, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. The Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and Ketuvim, the writings. I hope you found this useful or interesting or whatever you want to call it, and I hope I'll see you next week.